Good morning and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Rick Dunham. I'm White House correspondent for Business Week magazine, immediate past president of the National Press Club, and the current president of the Press Club's charitable and educational arm, the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library. On behalf of the National Press Club, I would like to thank our co-sponsors at this high-level conference, Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School and Foreign Policy magazine. I always enjoy doing programs with Woodrow Wilson School because my great-grandfather, James H. Dunham, was a student of Woodrow Wilson's at Princeton University. I'd also like to thank Julie Hsu, the membership director of the Press Club, Steve Barnes of Princeton University, and Will Dobson, the managing editor of Foreign Policy, for putting together this tremendous program. And to do a quick ad, can everyone remember to turn off their cell phones or anything that would make noise during the conference unless you want to have your private conversation live on C-SPAN? Our topic today is the current state of North Korea and the future of the U.S.-Korea alliance. We'll begin the program with an outstanding panel that will discuss intelligence challenges in North Korea. What do we really know about the DPRK? Moderating that panel will be Professor Aaron Friedberg of the Woodrow Wilson School. Aaron Friedberg is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School. From 2003 to 2005, during a public service leave from the school, he served as a Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs and Director of Policy Planning for Vice President Dick Cheney. He's the author of two books, The Weary Titan, Britain and the Experience of Relative Decline, 1895 to 1905, which received the Edgar Furness National Security Book Award, and In the Shadow of the Garrison State, Americans' Anti-Statism and its Cold War Grand Strategy. His areas of interest include international relations, international security in East Asia, foreign policy, and defense policy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Aaron Friedberg.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Welcome. I'm glad that you can join us. It's my pleasure to be here. Today's event is titled The Current State of North Korea and the Future of the U.S.-Korea Alliance. I'm going to make just a few brief remarks to frame today's sessions and introduce our panelists. But before I do that, I'd like to note that today's event is the result of a special collaboration between the National Press Club, Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, and Foreign Policy magazine. And this unusual collaborative effort has enabled us to provide a forum that permits us to analyze and debate what I think we can all agree is an extremely pressing global security problem. I'd like to say a special word of thanks to my colleague Steve Barnes, whose brainchild I think this event really was, and to our friends at the Press Club and Foreign Policy for working with us on this important event. I wish I could claim that we had been far-sighted enough last spring when we began to discuss this event to anticipate that this would be the week that Kim Jong-il decided to test a nuclear weapon, but I can't make that claim. Nevertheless, I do think that the events of this week cast into sharp relief precisely the kinds of analytical questions that we had in mind when we planned our conference. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States government, our foreign policy establishment, including our press, and of course the American people, have been confronted with two very different kinds of challenges to their ability to understand and interact effectively with the world. Challenges posed by highly closed and secretive authoritarian states and also non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, and those presented by newly opened and dynamic democratic or democratizing societies. And of course, the Korean Peninsula contains both. At one extreme, the DPRK, perhaps the closest thing to a truly totalitarian state remaining on the planet, just as an illustration of how little we do know about North Korea. We still don't know if, in fact, they did test a nuclear weapon this week, to say nothing of what their next move may be. At the other end of the spectrum, the Republic of Korea, a vibrant, rapidly evolving society being reshaped by powerful demographic, economic, and political forces. I would say most people in the United States, including in the United States government, don't really know with great assurance how the government of the Republic of Korea is going to respond to recent events, still less what the character, composition, and policies of a future ROK government might be. And our two panels today will help us to shed light on both of these sets of issues. Now, in the interest of fairness, because we realize that just as we in the United States often have difficulty understanding others, others so at times have difficulty understanding us, we're very pleased to be joined at lunch by Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill, who is perhaps better situated than anyone in Washington to give us some insight into the current thinking of the United States government. This morning's panel is titled Intelligence Challenges and North Korea, What Do We Really Know About the DPRK? And we have an outstanding group here to help us provide some answers to this question. First, we'll hear from my colleague Christopher Chyba, who's a professor of astrophysical sciences and international affairs at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He also directs the program on science and global security at the Wilson School. His security-related research emphasizes nuclear and biological weapons policy, proliferation, and terrorism. And during the period 1993 to 1995, he did a stint in the U.S. government, including time on the National Security Council staff. With Ambassador George Bunn, Chris is co-editor of the newly published book, U.S. Nuclear Weapons Policy, Confronting Today's Threats, from the Brookings Institution Press. Next, we'll hear from Marcus Noland. Dr. Noland is a senior fellow at the Institute for International Economics here in Washington. He has written extensively on the economies of Japan, Korea, and China, and is, I would say, unique among American economists in having devoted serious scholarly effort to understanding the problems of North Korea and the prospects and possible implications of Korean unification. He won the 2000-2001 Ohira Masayoshi Award for his book, Avoiding the Apocalypse, The Future of the Two Koreas. Most recently, he has co-authored a new book with Stephen Haggard titled Famine in North Korea, Markets, Aid, and Reform, which is forthcoming in February from Columbia University Press. Following Marcus will be Betsy Henderson, who is the Director of Research, Training, and Evaluation for Radio Free Asia, a U.S. government-funded broadcast network that targets those parts of Asia that still have media censorship. As RFA's first Director of Audience Research, she established a program for tracking information on media use and target audiences for the station's 8 language services. A fluent Mandarin speaker and former Associated Press reporter, she has lived and worked throughout East and Southeast Asia, including having lived in mainland China and Taiwan. Last, but certainly not least, we'll hear from Stephen Kim, who is an international security specialist with North Korea and East Asian expertise at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is part of the National Nuclear Security Administration within the Department of Energy. Prior to joining the laboratory, Stephen worked on strike operations issues for the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Defense Department as an analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis. So we have an exciting and informative discussion ahead of us. Let me just say our ground rules are that our speakers will present for about 8 minutes each, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. I've been instructed that we must end promptly at 10:35 to get in our next session. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Chris Chyba.
Thank you, Aaron. And good morning. It seems to me that there are 5 issues that now, in the week of the apparent test, we need to discuss this morning. The first is the North Korean plutonium program, how many bombs worth of plutonium they may have produced, and what the future trajectory of that program might be. The second is their putative high-enriched uranium program, and how much progress they may have made with the uranium path to the bomb. The third is their apparent nuclear test from earlier this week. And the fourth is their capability or inability to deliver a nuclear warhead via an intercontinental ballistic missile to the United States. Finally, the fifth that I would add excuse me, is attribution in the event of an attack against the U.S. or an ally. An ICBM launch is, of course, the most attributable kind of attack possible. Here I'm interested in the more difficult to attribute explosion that would result from successful nuclear smuggling or a ship exploding in a port, akin to a terrorist nuclear explosion. Attribution is important for deterring attack through the threat of punishment, for evaluating how likely the repetition of an attack would be, and finally for decisions about any counterattack that may take place. So what do we think we know? How do we think we know it? And what are the uncertainties in these estimates? Let me first say that I have access to no classified information on this topic. Throughout my remarks, I'll give examples of what can be gleaned from open source information to help illuminate these questions. Let me begin with the plutonium program. Reconstructing the amount of plutonium produced and reprocessed by North Korea depends almost entirely, not quite entirely, but almost entirely, on an assessment of the operating history of the 5-megawatt electric reactor in Yongbyon, and the number of times its fuel rods have been removed, as well as whatever losses may occur in reprocessing. Of course, reprocessing was frozen and the reactor was shut down under the agreed framework from 1994 to December 2002. Plutonium was probably obtained from the reactor in 1989, again in 2003 and in 2005. Uncertainties include such things as how often the reactor is running, its so-called capacity factor, which one can get at from overhead imaging. How long it was down in 1989 for refueling, evidently 70 days, and therefore the speed at which the refueling machine associated with the reactor could remove fuel rods from the reactor during that 70-day period. Could all the rods actually have been removed? Losses that take place in reprocessing, and so on. The best open estimates that are now in the literature suggest that something like 40 to 60 kilograms of plutonium have been produced by North Korea. The question is how much of that has actually been available to the bomb program, how much of it was lost, for example, in reprocessing. And that implies a jump in 1 to 2 warheads worth of plutonium prior to about 2003 versus perhaps 4 to 13 nuclear warheads now, depending on various loss processes, and also depending on whether the North Koreans need 4 or 5 or 6 kilograms of plutonium per warhead. And in fact, perhaps until this past week, whether they actually knew how to manufacture plutonium nuclear warheads at all. The future trajectory at this time is that there's a slowly evolving status quo. They're producing currently enough plutonium for 1 more warhead on average per year, and that will remain the case unless they complete construction and begin production with either of their other 2 plutonium production reactors that were frozen under the agreed framework and have been largely left moribund since that time, the 50-megawatt reactor at Yongbyon and a 200-megawatt potential reactor at Taechan. Completion of either of those reactors would put them in a qualitatively different place, producing tens of warheads of plutonium a year instead of 1. Commercially available overhead satellite imaging suggests that work at those sites is proceeding slowly, if at all. But reports there in the press have been few, and that's certainly something to watch. The putative, let me turn now to the putative high-enriched uranium program. Their program is based on the gas centrifuge, the uranium enrichment technology that is the most difficult to detect. To give you a sense of what's possible, if North Korea were using a P1 Pakistani-style centrifuge, the simplest design they're likely to have acquired, and if they needed 15 kilograms of HEU, high-enriched uranium, for a bomb, the Pakistani-Chinese design that evidently the AQ-CON network shared with Libya is purportedly a 15-kilogram design, then they would need about 1,500 centrifuges to produce one warhead worth of HEU a year. And that would probably correspond to a floor space about 40 feet square. The power requirements of that would also be low. So it's very difficult to observe these kinds of facilities. So how do we get knowledge about that program? Well, the first question I would ask is, what do the Pakistanis actually know? President Musharraf made a comment to the Kyoto News Agency in 2005, and this is a quote: "Yes, he, AQ Khan, passed centrifuges, parts and complete." Centrifuges of the DPRK. "I do not exactly remember the number." Musharraf's comments in his new book, In the Line of Fire, makes it clear that the more advanced P-2 Pakistani design was also provided to North Korea. There's some information, so that's what we know, I think, in the open literature from Pakistan. One hopes that the U.S. government knows more behind the scenes. I can't speak to that. There's also some information in the nuclear trade press. For example, there was a report in Platts Nuclear Fuels in 2003 that the DPRK was trying to buy aluminum tubing for 4,000 centrifuges, and that a shipment of 214 tubes with false freight papers had been intercepted and halted in Egypt while en route to the DPRK. It's natural to ask, what are the implications of these attempted purchases for the status of their uranium program? On the other hand, the exchanges with Pakistan seem only to have begun in the late 1990s. Iran's been working on its centrifuge program for 2 decades and is still years from production of a significant quantity of high-enriched uranium. So in the end, we really don't know, certainly from the open literature, how to assess this program. Again, I hope that the U.S. has more information available to it from the Pakistanis. My third topic is the apparent nuclear test, which seems reliably now to have been assigned a seismic magnitude of 4.2. There are seismic signals recorded by the International Monitoring System that are archived in the International Data Center under the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. Those are available to signatories and not to the public. In the open press, though, you can go to a variety of websites, such as the U.S. Geological Survey website or the IRIS, Incorporated Research Institutions of Seismology, Seismic Monitor website, which shows you a kind of real-time global display of earthquakes and or seismic events and their magnitudes around the world. A magnitude, now one has to convert that 4.2 seismic yield, that 4.2 seismic magnitude to an estimate of nuclear yield. That depends some on geology, but the suggestion is that from those standard relations is that the size of the explosion was something in the 500 ton to 1 kiloton range, much lower than, say, the Nagasaki plutonium weapon the U.S. exploded, which was in the range of 22 kilotons. Why was it so low? Why was the North Korean yield so low? There are a variety of possible explanations. At one extreme, they were trying to do something very sophisticated. At the other extreme, it wasn't a nuclear explosion at all. It was a conventional explosion. I think the dominant speculation in the press in the U.S. has been that it was a fizzle yield, either for a variety of reasons, that they didn't quite master the explosion technology, the timing of the high explosives, the injection needed to start the chain reaction. A variety of things could have gone wrong. This word fizzle is something of a term of art. One wants to remember that a fizzle yield of 1 kiloton would still excavate a crater the size of a football field in a major city and kill a substantial fraction of the people within half a mile of the explosion. So just because the yield was small compared to some other first attempts, one doesn't want to lose sight of how dramatic and horrifying such an attack would be were it to take place in a city. Finally, there's also the issue of decoupling. Could they have tried to muffle the seismic signature of their explosion? That's unlikely, but probably not impossible. It's hard to understand what their motives for such decoupling would be. I can talk about these various options in more detail. Their capability, let me turn finally to their capability to deliver a nuclear warhead to the U.S. There, an important question is whether or not they actually obtained, if they have a uranium program, did they obtain a high-enriched uranium warhead design from the AQ-Khan network, as Libya did? Estimates in the open literature, based on the one hand on a Chinese military encyclopedia entry, and on the other on photographs you can find on the web of the re-entry vehicle from the 4th Chinese test, which is thought to be the design provided by Pakistan. The re-entry vehicles in the museum yard, the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, suggests that the warhead re-entry vehicle package weighs over 1,200 kilograms. The range and the payload of the Taipodong-2 missile tested last July, the missile failed about 40 seconds into flight, is not known. It was only tested once. But estimates in the literature that I think should be taken with a grain of salt suggest a range that could reach the western United States. General Eugene Hebiger, former commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, has said that the Taipodong-2 could deliver a 300-kilogram warhead to the U.S. There's a mismatch then of a factor of several, even if they had this advanced design from the AQ-Khan network. Hebiger has also pointed out that it took the U.S. 6 to 8 years to an intensive engineering development and an aggressive nuclear testing program to go from 4,000 to 5,000 kilogram warheads it initially had down to 1,000 kilogram warheads for its missiles. So between the warhead miniaturization issues and the failure of the Taipong 2 test, the DPRK certainly can't yet deliver a missile warhead to the U.S. But on the other hand, one learns from failure. Every missile program begins with failures. Let me close then with just a comment about attribution. In assessing the likelihood of a North Korean nuclear attack on the U.S., one has to consider both capabilities and motivations. Only the first of those is a technical question. About a year ago, I co-chaired for the Princeton Project on National Security a working group, a bipartisan working group on relative threat assessment. We decided to do an assessment of the assessments. We looked back 10 years at unclassified government threat assessments and non-governmental threat assessments. You can find this on the web. One of the things that we were struck by was how much modern threat assessments rely on capabilities and how little they often have to say about motivations. And that the contrast of that with what is arguably the most successful threat assessment in modern U.S. history, which is George Kennan's X article that set the groundwork for U.S. containment policy, is strong. If you look at that article, it's almost entirely about Soviet motives based on a deep knowledge of Soviet language and Russian culture rather than capabilities. But suppose the DPRK were to have the capability for an ICBM attack on the U.S. Of course, an ICBM attack is the most attributable attack possible. We'll know exactly where that ICBM came from. So one has to worry about the possibility of other means of delivery that would be less attributable. In this sense, the ability to do post-attack forensics and try to determine the origin of a nuclear weapon based on the debris from the explosion is extremely important. And in that sense, the North Koreans may have done us one kind of favor, only one kind of favor, but one kind of favor with this test by giving us some knowledge of what the radioactive debris of the test from one of their weapons looks like, assuming that, in fact, we are successful in detecting any radionuclides from that explosion. Of course, that test has a negative impact overall for the nuclear nonproliferation regime, a regime that I believe remains extremely important to national and international security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here this morning. The North Korean economy has been in decline since the mid-1980s. That decline accelerated in 1990 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And by the early 1990s, considerable system fraying in North Korea was evident. That process reached its greatest heights in the mid-1990s when a famine occurred that led to a progressive marketization of the economy as the state was unable to maintain its obligations under the social compact. By the late 1990s, the situation began to stabilize, and the government undertook a number of actions that both ratified in some respects, but also sought to control and in some respects reverse this bottom-up process of marketization that had occurred over the previous decade. That culminated in reforms announced in 2002, which are better understood as a reaction to this bottom-up transition that had occurred over the previous decade than a top-down proactive attempt at reform. The result has been widening inequality within North Korea, with the famine of the mid-1990s morphing into a situation of chronic food insecurity, which afflicts the urban non-elite the worst. In the past year, the North Korean government has undertaken a number of reckless policies that increase the likelihood of humanitarian emergency. It has banned the private trade in grain and engaged in a failed attempt to revive the state-run quantity rationing system for the distribution of food. The market had become the primary mechanism by which most North Korean households actually obtained their food, and so by banning the private trade in grain, the state criminalized the primary mechanism by which people obtained food. That's on the demand side. On the supply side, the government engaged in confiscatory seizures in the rural areas, which have had effects on cultivators and their willingness to supply food. And finally, it engaged in a squeeze on the World Food Program and private humanitarian groups that has effectively eliminated the rest of the world's early warning system for humanitarian distress in North Korea. The WFP had a number of sub-offices around the country, and those NGO workers and WFP workers were effectively the canary in the mine shaft with understanding what was actually going on in the countryside. That canary has now been removed. And all of this was before this week's events. There is some evidence that over the past year the North Koreans have been preparing to hunker down, hoarding fuel, presumably in anticipation of economic sanctions following one of their provocations. And indeed, the stockpiling of fuel may explain the apparent drop in economic activity in certain sectors of the North Korean economy. The United Nations is likely to respond to recent events with some kind of economic sanctions, and it's worth considering their possible impact. The first issue is how vulnerable North Korea is to sanctions. If one constructs a balance of payments for North Korea, in recent years it appears that North Korea has obtained revenues in roughly equal value from three categories of exchange. The first would be legitimate commerce. The second would be aid. And the third would be undesirable activities such as counterfeiting, drug trafficking, smuggling, including smuggling of endangered species parts, and missile sales, the last not being illegal, though undesirable, at least from a United States standpoint. The position that has been articulated frequently in recent days is that North Korea is essentially too isolated for sanctions to work, but that focuses only on that first category of exchange, the actual legitimate exports that we observe. In fact, they have a broader set of vulnerabilities. So could the sanctions work in the case at hand? Well, I would posit, for the sake of this analysis, that the possession of nuclear weapons is a core political goal of the Kim Jong-il regime, and the history of economic sanctions worldwide is that sanctions are unlikely to work if they are aimed at core political priorities of the target state. So history is not on our side if we expect economic sanctions to alter North Korean behavior in this respect. If they were to work, they would almost surely have to be comprehensive sanctions along the lines originally proposed by Japan. This involved a complete ban on trade with a humanitarian aid exclusion and the severing of all financial transactions. The Japanese proposal had two great virtues. First of all, it was powerful enough that it stood some chance of working. And secondly, it was administratively simple. If you ban all trade except for aid, then any ship going in or out of North Korea not flying the UN flag is presumptively up to no good. Now, the Japanese proposal had a significant downside as well, and that is that it would almost surely intensify distress among the common people of North Korea who have no effective voice or control over the actions of their government. And in this context, I can't help but observe the extraordinary hypocrisy embodied in the South Korean government position, which amounts to cutting off aid to flood victims while maintaining the projects and the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Mount Kumgang Tourism Project, which put foreign exchange directly in the hands of the North Korean government. Now, in contrast to the Japanese proposal, the actual proposal that is likely to come out of the United Nations is for a partial sanctions regime. This is probably going to be too weak to affect North Korean behavior on these issues. Its administrative complexity almost invites circumvention, and indeed is likely to lead to tension among the sanctioning countries as they get into disputes about each of their relative transparency and rigor in implementing the sanctions. And what we have observed in Iraq over the last 10 to 15 years, I think, is an example of what we can expect if we try to implement a complicated partial sanction regime on North Korea. And then finally, by not dealing with the North Koreans firmly, because I don't think they are going to change their behavior in the face of what the UN is proposing, what is being discussed within the UN, this approach is actually likely to increase the probability of miscalculation on their part in the future, and thereby increases the likelihood of something truly catastrophic happening on the peninsula. So why do it if it's unlikely to be effective? Well, there's possibly some purely symbolic utility to doing this on the part of the sanctioning governments. There is possibly a repeated game aspect to this, the notion that essentially the United States, Japan, the UK, France, having gotten China to sign on to punitive sanctions this time around, if there is a future iteration of this process, then we can pull China even closer to our position, which would have the possibility of sanctions that might actually work. And the third reason is to deter emulation by underlining that there are costs to North Korea-style behavior. This argument is typically made with respect to Iran, but I think that the number of countries that are watching this situation very closely is much broader. And you may want to impose pain on North Korea, even if you don't think it's going to alter North Korea's behavior, simply to deter others from emulating in the future. Bottom line is the world is on a very bad trajectory here. North Korea appears determined to develop nuclear weapons. The rest of the world appears to be unwilling to either apply sufficient punishment or inducements to alter the North Koreans from this path. And I predict that 2 years from now, the North Korean people will be worse off, and the world will have acquiesced in North Korea being a nuclear power. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this prestigious panel. I'll focus my remarks on how people in North Korea get their information. If you want to get a sense of how information poor the DPRK is, you might want to consider this. Out of 194 countries and territories Freedom House looked at in its Press Freedom Index, North Korea ranked 194th. And Reporters Without Borders index of 167 countries put North Korea at, you guessed it, 167th. Reporters Without Borders went on to call the DPRK a black hole for news. But as anyone who's been to a cocktail party knows, there is more than one shade of black, and my job has been to try and make out the various shades of black in the darkness of North Korea. My conclusion is that there have been some changes in the blackness of North Korea, away from the darkest midnight shades in the last half dozen years. Policymakers need to be tuned into these changes to understand where that country might be moving. Radio Free Asia began broadcasting to North Korea in March of 1997, and we started doing research on the North Korean media environment in 1998. Since then, we've done numerous systematic interviews with defectors and refugees to learn about changes in the country and the environment for information, and of course, reactions to international broadcasts. Since 1993, a series of 4 quantitative surveys have been conducted with defectors in Seoul, each with an N of 200. Our most recent quantitative survey was conducted in March and April of this year. The respondents left North Korea some time ago. At least a year ago for most of them. RFA has used interview projects as well as anecdotal information to formulate questions to put on its survey questionnaires, and this has proven quite fruitful. Again, this is making ample use of open source information, and with a focused effort, I think we've learned quite a bit about North Korean society. So what do we know about the experiences of these defectors and refugees when they were still in North Korea? First, we've learned clearly that in the black hole for information, word of mouth is a critical source of news for ordinary people, and even for elites. We've seen this in our work with refugees who recently left the DPRK, and it's bolstered by repeated survey results. While television, specifically the Pyongyang television, is consistently named as the top source of information for defectors when they were in North Korea, word-of-mouth sources were close behind each year in the survey. In the most recent survey, 34% said television was their top information source. 22% said Chinese merchants and smugglers were their number one source of information. That's the second highest response. The third highest response, 19% said friends and family were their top source of information. South Korean radio followed farther behind at 8%, and international radio at 6%. So clearly, in terms of outside media, they're secondary sources. When you go to secondary and tertiary sources, that number bumps up quite considerably. Second, we know that North Koreans are keenly aware of the risks of accessing banned media. Yet, they actively seek it out, and they succeed in getting it. Officially, all North Korean radios and televisions must be fixed to receive only official channels. And these radios and televisions all must be registered with public security. Historically, the penalties for defying these regulations were unfathomably harsh. People have been sent to gulags for years based on listening to South Korean radio stations. No wonder defectors told us in 1999 that they listened under heavy quilts, so even family members wouldn't know. As one woman said, and I quote you, "I knew my husband listened secretly, but I never said anything to him. I think my husband knew I listened, but he didn't say anything either. We pretended that we didn't know about each other. I thought it was safer not to ask my children if they listened." Anecdotally, we'd heard many stories like that. We'd also heard stories about people pulling the wires off these fixed channel radios, breaking the seals, and in other ways rejiggering their radios to receive illegal stations, especially South Korea's KBS social education programs. We'd also heard about people keeping one radio to show the police and another one hidden underneath their bed or somewhere else with a tunable dial. We really don't know how widespread it is. Actually, among the defector group, it was quite widespread. Across the years, although a majority of people knew about the penalties for listening to illegal media, a significant chunk actually themselves had broken the seals on their radios and televisions. In the most recent survey, 3/4 said that they knew about regulations against listening to foreign media, and yet 35% said they themselves had modified their fixed channel radios to get South Korean or foreign radio. Even more knew someone else who had done the same thing. Furthermore, 11% said they had more than one radio in their home. As for television, 23% said they adjusted their televisions to get outside stations, mostly from China. 20% said they'd watched Chinese television while in the DPRK, and 7% said they'd seen South Korean television. For outside radio, again, KBS dominated, but in spite of the obstacles and transmission, among which is transmission limited to shortwave, Radio Free Asia has always had a measurable audience. Qualitative work with most recent arrivals from North Korea suggests that the impact of these stations is increasing for a number of reasons. Again, looking through the qualitative interviews over the course of a number of years, the interviews suggest a certain breakdown in social control. People say, well, you know, we used to not be able to do this sort of thing, but now people can get paid off. Authorities are looking the other way. They have other priorities. And certainly there are a lot more smuggled equipment coming in. Recent interviews also suggest young people especially are willing to take the risk. We had one person tell us he listened in a dorm room with 7 other classmates, each of them vowing not to tell anyone else. Increased exposure to the outside world, you know, it's a highly cut-off place, but increased exposure to the outside world also is making this outside information more comprehensible to people. Previously, defectors and refugees literally would not understand terms that were used in broadcasts, concepts that they had never known about, and even South Korean accents. Now this is changing quite a bit, which suggests people are getting a lot more exposure. Still, I don't know exactly how I would cover this event for a North Korean audience. We find consistently that discussions of the nuclear issue, six-party talks, and high politics still bewilder most of the people we talk to, and even people who seem relatively elite. And we also find suspicions about the motives behind the broadcasts. Third, the impact of China on the mindset of North Korean people cannot be underestimated. The famines of the late 1990s sent many refugees over the border in far greater numbers than previously. And what they saw and heard dazzled them. Among the observations that we heard, In China, even dogs eat rice. At night, the towns in China have lights on. In private and even in some public settings, Chinese make sarcastic comments about their leaders. People in China say South Korea is even richer than China. These are shocking and enlightening pieces of information that get back to North Korea. Information about China and the world get back into the DPRK in many forms. As mentioned before, word of mouth, and also Chinese television and radio. Also by North Koreans, there are people who move back and forth both legally and illegally. And as mentioned also by Dr. Noland, there's an increase in smuggling, and they're bringing in more equipment, not just radios, not just televisions, but also videos, and cell phones are smuggled in. Missionaries seem to be playing a role in promoting this flow of information. Again, anecdotes suggested that defectors and refugees are hiring middlemen to take disposable cell phones linked into the Chinese networks back into the DPRK, because Chinese networks do cover parts of the DPRK. Our defector survey says that the impact of this is significant, though its scope is a bit unclear. 9% of defectors said they'd had cell phones in North Korea. 8% got those phones either informally or illegally. 8% of this year's group said that their relatives in North Korea have cell phones and that they communicate with them through cell phones. Last year that number was significantly higher, 23%, though most of the people said they limited their conversation to personal matters. I wouldn't expect them to be talking about nuclear issues. Fourth, and this really should be no surprise, the impact of the internet in North Korea is extremely limited and indirect. Don't laugh too hard. Last year, 15% of the defector group said that they were aware of the internet while in North Korea, and this year that number was 6%. Last year, 3% said they'd actually accessed the internet while in North Korea, and this number was 5% this year. There's a little bit of a lag because it takes some time for defectors to make it to South Korea, but still, small numbers. Okay. While this is an extremely small number, it's worth noting that South Korea is the absolute most wired country in Asia, with per capita internet penetration outstripping both Japan and China. The Korean language content on the web is extremely rich. Anecdotal evidence suggests that missionaries are hooking up refugees with web content, and we're starting to see that in some of our interviews. You know, with people saying that they had seen things on the internet about North Korea that they found interesting. That funnels into the word of mouth information getting back into North Korea. So just to review, we know word of mouth is a critically important source of information for North Koreans. We know people take the risks to access banned media and succeed. We know China is a critical source of information, inspiration, and equipment for North Korean people. And we know that while cell phones are already expanding the word of mouth network, the internet's direct impact is minuscule. But stay tuned. Finally, we know information in all channels is growing, and its impact on North Koreans is growing too, all in the context of a very, very dark place. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. I just need to preface my remarks by saying these are my personal views, and the views don't represent the views of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory or Department of Energy or any of the other government agencies that I work with. In the interest of time, I'll try to go through my talk as quickly as possible. Erin asked me to provide a picture of the inner workings of the Kim regime and of Kim Jong-il's role as leader, with a focus on the role of defector accounts. I recall Walter Mondale said that anyone who claims to know North Korea is either a fool or a liar. Given this easy task that Aaron has given me, I fear I will come across as both. And I'm sure this will do wonders for my professional reputation. Thank you, Aaron. I will try my best to provide what I think I know and hope to introduce some information and insights that might not be in the North Korean vernacular. Some of the questions that Aaron asked me to address are as follows. One, why do you think these reports are useful in this case? Do they get enough attention from analysts in the West? And if not, why not? There certainly is a paucity of information and data, but we do know some things. One just needs to know where to look. A vast majority of information is in Korean and not in English. As I think all of you know, in English, So Dae-suk's biography of Kim Il-sung remains the sine qua non of North Korean leadership literature. I think most people here know Lee Jung-sik and Robert Scalapino's work, and Bruce Cummings' Origins of the Korean War are mandatory reading. But even So's impressive collection of works, and he has about 4 or 5 books on North Korea, give little guidance to how Kim Jong-il's son actually operates. And for that, I think we have to turn to recent Korean sources in books and in articles. We have the book by the former number 2 man at NSC and now the current Minister of Unification, Lee Jong-suk, and he has written something called Understanding North Korea. But I think just as Bruce Cummings relies heavily on mid to low level North Korean Communist Party documents captured by UN forces in 1950-51, Lee Jong-suk also relies heavily on published issues of the Nodong Shinmun. He does not have any special access. He didn't when he was writing that book. I'm certainly not here to pick a fight with either Korean or American revisionists, but I do suggest that scholars and observers and hopefully policymakers of North Korea will not ignore the accounts of high-level defectors and those who have spent time with Kim Jong-il. I don't want to butcher Plato's allegory of the cave, but for the first time, I think we have some sense of those who have emerged from the North Korean cave, however damaged they do emerge. And the accounts that I would like to introduce are, and I think most of you know, but let me just repeat. Hwang Jung-yeop's I Have Witnessed the Truth of History, Lee Han-young's Royal Family of Kim Jong-il, Lee Young-guk's I Was Kim Jong-il's Bodyguard, Fujimoto Kenji's I Was Kim Jong-il's Personal Chef, Son Kwang-soo's Kim Jong-il Report, and the most recent one is Ho Hae-il's Magic Glass of North Korea. It is unfortunate that most analysts and observers of Korean affairs cannot read Korean because they do miss out on quite a bit. A lot of the works that I just introduced are translated in part, but a complete translation has yet to emerge in public. We certainly have, in addition to this, defectors' accounts, both in high, middle, and low levels, which had much more variety and color to our understanding of Kim Jong-il and his leadership. We have pretty good accounts from a lot of internet portal newspaper sites, such as Free NK and Daily NK, as well as Oh My News and Media News as well. Now, defectors' testimony might be, and they are by some, frowned upon, considered unreliable. But if one had a wide range of access to information on North Korea, that would be legitimate, I would argue, and that it should be considered one among many. But given the paucity of information, I do think we have no choice but to rely as much as we can on defectors' account. And I will elaborate on that remark at the end. The second question I was asked to address is, what can we learn from these accounts about how decisions are made in North Korea, about the structure of power among the elites? Are there evidence of splits or factions? I can categorically say that we do not know much about how decisions are made. We have a lot of speculation and conjectures. But let me introduce two accounts. Son Gwangju, in his rather long but very meticulously researched book, outlines how decisions are actually made in North Korea. And his argument is that the party, the KWP, actually controls the KPA, the military. He cites the party's secretariat office, which consists of 5 people: the commander of the KPA, the commander of the general staff, the chief of the political department, and chief of the operation department, and the KWP executive. A key organization, he argues, is the Organization and Guidance Department, especially the 13th Bureau that gives direction to and controls the KPA. Currently, Lee Young-chul, another first vice director of the OGD, heads this up. A journalist by the name of Kim Hyung-soo has written a pretty good account on upkorea.net, in which he argues that Kim Jong-un controls the military and the party through 5 key people. And I'll just briefly mention them. His name is Hwang Pyeong-seo. He's the KWP OGD Vice Director. Lee Myung-soo, KPA Chief of General Staff, Director of Operations. Hyun Chol-rae, KPA Director of Organization and Political Department, Director of Organization. And Park Jae-kyung, KPA Director of Propaganda, the Political Department. And Lee Young-chul, KWP Organization Guidance Department, First Vice Director. In effect, these two accounts indicate that there are KWP political directors who control the KPA. The KPA, according to these accounts, have very little independence on their own. He goes on to say that Kim Jong-il's style of decision-making is very different than that of his father. For example, he cites that Kim Il-sung's command and control in times of war was that it would go from Kim to the KPA chief, to the chief of the political department, and to the chief of the general staff. Under Kim Jong-il, the wartime command and control goes from Kim and goes directly to the director of operations department of the general staff, Lee Myung-soo. So he has cut out the middleman. He has cut out the involvement of the KPA chief or the KPA chief of political department. There are other more detailed breakdown of what Son considers Kim Jong-il's kitchen cabinet, as well as those he trusts carry out his orders. But in the interest of repeating Kim and Lee and Park and Chung, I will leave that. I'll answer that question in detail if somebody has any questions later. I was also asked to address what about the structure of power among the top elites. For that, I think we have to refer to the recently published book by Ho Hae-il, and the title of that is The Magic Glass of North Korea. And he breaks down the composition of the North Korean elite as such. He says that the population is about 40% elite members, and of those 40%, he breaks down this faction into 2. One, the first faction, these are people who come from the right background with some skills, mostly from the party organizations or the security organization. And the second faction is those whose background are not so stellar, but they have very solid, useful individual skills, and they work mostly in the economy or in certain sectors of the public administration. Ho argues that the first group has witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and they are of the mind that they will go to the end with Kim Jong-il. They know they have lived off their parents' and family's good name, have been getting special treatment, and they fear that they have no skills or skill sets that can be used in a capitalistic society. The second group of that elite consists of what he quotes as smart but opportunistic people. They know, quote, this is not the right way, but they cannot let go of the privileges they receive for being loyal to the regime. They have to be this way for self-survival, according to Ho. And below the elites, he says that there are 35% of the population is about, he considers them, 35% are comprised of scientists, skilled workers, writers, artists, professors, doctors, and he includes the students there also, and he considers this the middle class. And he says that their anti-state feelings are relatively low. And below that, 25% are considered the hostile group. These are those from quote-unquote bad background, and so they receive actually no privileges. Their frame of mind is, I hope there's a war so that everything will be destroyed and we can start anew. The regime, the Kim Jong-un regime, has a list of those to execute from this group, according to Ho. Also, according to Ho, the Kim Jong-un regime fears the middle class, or the middle class group, the most. And the reason is that he feels that these people possess the skills that would allow them to eat and live in a capitalistic society, and they are susceptible to capitalist influences. Lastly, he argues that the military is extremely corrupt, and that the KPA is weakening overall. But he also argues that there are about 130,000 special forces who may fight to the very end. Another question that Aaron posed for me is, are there evidence of splits or factions? Some, I won't name who, have claimed that there are doves and hawks, and that our policy somehow made the hawks of the KPA constrain Kim Jong-il and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who want to negotiate with us. I see absolutely no evidence for this assertion. To be sure, there may be varied personal interests under Kim Jong-il, but I think there really is, in essence, a faction of one. And I think the recent article in Shindong, a monthly magazine in South Korea, I think it's the latest issue, in which this journalist argues very convincingly, contrary to leftist scholars like Kang Jong-gu, that Kim Jong-un had personally ordered and directed the incursions into the West Sea in 1999 as well as in 2002. As unique as North Korea may be, I think many members of the panel pointed out, it is a completely totalitarian state. The absolute fear that permeates a totalitarian state and society is something I think we who have been living in liberal, free societies find very hard to fathom. A society that prohibits freedom of movement, a state that keeps tight surveillance over its people, that excuses no mistakes, I think will be very alien to those who enjoy the federal highway system, the Second Amendment, and due process. Let me just conclude my remark, since I just got the yank. Let me just conclude I think the most important question Aaron wanted me to ask is, in light of recent controversies over Iraq, is this kind of information, is it reliable to paint an accurate picture? Why should we listen to what the defectors are telling us, and how can we know if they're telling the truth or not? Chung Gi-won, who is considered the Oscar Schindler of North Korea, and one who has rescued more North Koreans by himself than all of the world's intelligence agencies combined, told me over the course of 2 days that many North Korean defectors, the very defectors that he's rescued, are liars, schemers, and exaggerators. Many of them have no moral compass or foundation, and he was shedding tears as he was saying this. Chun confided that their testimony on nuclear or chemical or biological weapon programs are not credible. He relayed the example of a wife of a man from Yongbyon that he met. She sounded very, very credible, but after an in-depth vetting, everyone realized that she had no direct knowledge of North Korea's nuclear program. It's even more pronounced with leadership issues, obviously. But he was emphatic in conveying to me the message that the stories of starvation and even eating human flesh are true, and their testimony leaves out details that are much worse than one can imagine. They hide these atrocious details because they fear that the civilized world and the South Korean government would simply not believe them. Defectors' account certainly cannot completely fill the gap on information about North Korea. I have noted the caution with which one needs to approach their accounts, but caution is not tantamount to dismissal. Moreover, I believe it would behoove rigid skeptics of defectors' testimony to be mindful of history I think the journalist Jay Norlinger said it best. Stories of the Holocaust that made its way to Western Europe and the United States were billed as Jewish whining. Accounts of the Soviet Union were dismissed as rumors in Riga. Accounts of defectors from Mao's Cultural Revolution who made it to Hong Kong were labeled as warlordism. Those who escaped from Castro and told their story were called Batista's stooges. As noted earlier, defectors' testimony and accounts may be looked down upon, considered unreliable. However, in the case of North Korea, their accounts cannot be ignored in the current situation because we know so little. Indeed, the accounts may be anecdotal, but I'd say the plural of anecdote is data. T.S. Eliot said, "All I have is a voice to unfold the folded lie." And even though I'm getting the hook, I hope I have been able to contribute to some of that unfolding. And in the process, I hope I have come across neither as a liar nor a fool, but as a student. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Schott with Radio Valera Venezuela and Selecta Magazine of Panama. My question is to Mr. Chyba, who said apparently North Korea has conducted a nuclear test. Why is it so difficult to prove if North Korea has conducted a nuclear test or not? So you are working on assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's very likely that they conducted a nuclear test. To date, there have been no reports of measurements of any radionuclides. That would be the radiation given off by a test that would escape from the underground site. Presumably, nations have been attempting to collect both dust, which could incorporate radioactive dust, as well as sample for gases in the atmosphere that are produced by nuclear explosions, typically xenon or krypton. Until we have that kind of detection, which we may or may not get, depending on how well confined the test was, we won't be able to say with absolute certainty that there was a nuclear test. What we have is a seismic event that is clearly distinct from an earthquake. It was certainly not an earthquake. The question is, could it have been a conventional explosion instead? I think that is extremely unlikely because this would be right up at the upper end of the largest conventional explosions that have ever taken place. And there's a real challenge in making a conventional explosion happen instantaneously when it's that big. So I view this as I view the non-nuclear explanation as very likely, but without the radiation measurements, you can't say with absolute certainty that it wasn't nuclear.
Morning, Bruce Malashevich, private citizen. Just for the panel generally, if you were president, how would you go about formulating policy in reaction to the nuclear test?
That's the $64,000 question. Would anyone like to answer?
I think you should answer that.
No. It's a very good question. Mac Dessler.
Mac Dessler, University of Maryland and Woodrow Wilson School graduate. This extraordinarily informative panel has said little, if anything, about the question of negotiations and perhaps the will-o'-the-wisp notion now that North Korea could be negotiated away. If you were president, to narrow the previous question a little bit, would anyone in the panel like to talk about whether we should still try a serious form of negotiations and what could be done that has not been done before that might, at least would be worth trying?
I'm going to sharpen that even further and pick on Marcus. You talked a bit about sanctions and indicated that there may be reasons for applying them, even if it's a long shot. Could you say a bit more about what might be done to increase their chances of success?
Sure. I think the basic problem is that we, the international community, and primarily here, United States, Japan, China, and South Korea, face a massive coordination problem. In theory, what we would like to do is push the North Koreans to the point where they are forced to make a very stark choice. And Chris Hill this afternoon will give this to you in much more vivid and obviously much more official language. But basically what we want to do is give them a choice between, on the one hand, keeping their nuclear program but being isolated economically and diplomatically, or giving up the nuclear program, at which point we try to facilitate their integration into the world, into global society in a better and more prosperous way for them. The problem is that attempts by the United States and Japan on the one hand to apply pressure to North Korea to essentially force them to the wall where they have to make that choice is undercut by the revealed preference or behavior of South Korea and China to support the regime. Because for reasons that are understandable if debatable, they, by their apparent behavior, fear political instability in the North more than they fear a nuclear-armed North Korea. And so you have the United States and Japan trying to push the North Koreans to force them into this stark choice. And you have that process being undercut by South Korea and China. And as a consequence, North Korea, in some sense, gets its cake and eats it too. It can continue to work on the nuclear program, temporizing, with, I think, a reasonably credible confidence that at the end of the day they will be bailed out by South Korea and China. So, what can you do to kind of get yourself out of that track? I dumped on the current discussions within the UN for sanctions, which I don't think are going to be significant enough to get North Korea to alter its behavior in any fundamental way. If you were going to increase the likelihood of that, I think the sanctions have to be more comprehensive than the ones that are currently under discussion. But a process of sanctioning North Korea, especially if it were backed in the case of China by additional measures that would not come under the UN sanctions, but is certainly within China's capacity to do, that is to say, cutting off Chinese flows of fuel oil to North Korea and cutting off Chinese supplies of food, could put enough pressure on North Korea that they would be induced to come back to the six-party talks and negotiate in a sincere way. Now, I want to be quite clear. This is all speculative. This is all a possibility, and I'm not sure the likelihood of this actually, of us actually attaining this in a successful manner is very high. But if we are going to attain it, I think the key issue is not only getting sanctions through the UN, but getting China and to a secondary extent South Korea to go beyond the UN sanctions, put more pressure on the North Koreans, signal to them that this game is up, and then induce them to participate in the multilateral negotiations process.
Thank you. Chris?
I would just add one brief comment, which is that in the six-party agreement of September 2005, the agreement called for the verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. One of the technically very challenging aspects of that would be the verifiable, the verification that a high-enriched uranium centrifuge program did not exist in North Korea. The dismantlement of uranium enrichment programs has been verified in the past. It was done by the IAEA when the South Africans terminated their uranium bomb program. But doing that reliably required enormous access to individuals as well as to facilities. And that's something that currently I think it's hard to imagine how one does successfully, how one negotiates that level of access successfully with the North Korean regime. It's a very important challenge.
I'm Bruce McDonald. I'm a national security technology consultant and a Woodrow Wilson School alum. I want to address my question to Chris Chyba and anybody else on the panel who might wish to comment. If there's anything scarier than North Korea, the thought of North Korea possessing a nuclear weapon, it's the thought that North Korea, in its straitened economic circumstances, might pass this along to a terrorist group that had a lot of money. They certainly have shown a great willingness, as Bob Gallucci and others have pointed out, to sell missile technology to others. And so my question is, it comes down to, well, with one more point. William Perry and others have suggested that one way to have a more robust deterrence policy to try to deal with this is drawing, Chris, on your point about the forensics, that if we found that a terrorist group set off a crude nuclear device of some kind, and forensically we were able to determine that the material or the bomb somehow we could trace it to North Korea, that we would treat that as an attack by North Korea upon the United States. This kind of very robust deterrence policy has a lot of implications. My question is, one, do you think that would be effective in deterring North Korea from passing on nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology to terrorist groups? And two, what do you think, and people on the panel think, the reaction of China and South Korea that play such a critical role on this issue, how they might react to such an enunciation of such a policy?
Thank you. Chris?
Thank you. It strikes me very much that others on the panel, and in particular Mr. Kim, may well want to respond to that question. Let me just make a few comments. I meant what I said earlier about George Kennan's remarks. These sort of discussions cannot simply be based on technical assessments of capabilities. They require a very different, and I think harder to obtain, as hard as the technical knowledge is to obtain, harder to obtain kind of deep knowledge about one's adversary. With respect to the first point, the North Korean supposed willingness to sell their technologies, obviously their missile technology, widely. Broadly, I agree with that concern. I would point out, however, that I know of no evidence that the North Koreans have ever attempted to sell chemical weapons anywhere in the world. I'm not trying to make, the last thing I would want to do is try to make excuses for the North Korean regime. But it's a little too easy to say, as one often sees, that they'll sell anything to anybody. The South Korean military estimates that they have thousands of tons of chemical weapons, and in the open literature, to my knowledge, there is not evidence that they've attempted to sell those weapons. Whether that implies that they have some threshold beyond which they won't go is unclear to me, but I view it as uncertain that they would be willing to sell nuclear weapons, especially since they must have so few, and especially since they have to realize that the consequences of an attributed attack would be the end of their regime. I can't speak for Bill Perry, and I'm not familiar with his exact remarks on this topic. I would say that making a public statement of the kind that you characterized runs the risk of what the political scientists call a commitment trap. You don't want to be on record saying you absolutely will retaliate in a certain way if X occurs, because when X occurs, X may turn out to be fairly ambiguous, or there may be mitigating circumstances, and you don't want to be trapped by some previous commitment. However, I would assume that the United States is communicating to North Korea. I certainly hope that it is, and making it clear to the other members of the six-party talks that were it to be the case that there were a terrorist nuclear explosion against the United States, and were there evidence that that material originated in North Korea, that there would be the most severe consequences for the DPRK. I would only end this by saying that currently it may be difficult to attribute a nuclear explosion in a way that is viewed as a reliable attribution by the international community, and that is a very important problem.
Stephen, would you like to take a crack?
They'll bring it up.
I think I think the premise of that question gets to the argument that we should not confront Kim Jong-il because he will lash out. And obviously the advocates of this view cite psychological profiles of a demented Kim, drawing the analogy of a cornered rat, to make the case that dialogue is the only and sole answer, since he may resort to violence. But I must ask, I'm not a psychologist, but I am a historian, so when did Kim or North Korea engage in violent acts? Were they in response to our hardline policies or actions, or did they occur when things were relatively quiet? I think in every instance of violent behavior on the part of the North Koreans, there was a lull, a quiet time preceding the violence, and I would cite the following: 1968 North Korean commando attack on the Blue House, 1974 assassination attempt on Park Chung-hee, 1983 assassination attempt on Chun Doo-hwan in Burma, 1987 bombing of the Korean airline, 1996 the submarine incursions into Gangneung, 1999 the June 15th incursion into South Korean maritime territory. 2002, right on the eve of the World Cup finals, attack on South Korean vessels in the West Sea. I only know of two historical instances when North Korea reacted to our hardline policy, which is, I think there are only two instances. 1953, when we were negotiating the Korean armistice, North Korea finally signed the agreement after newly President-elect Eisenhower made it absolutely clear that he would consider all weapons in our arsenal. And in 1994, at the height of the first crisis, President Clinton deployed Patriot missiles to South Korea, made plans to resume joint war exercises, and reinforced U.S. troops in South Korea. So, and let me just, since I have the notes here, I'll just quote, if you don't believe me, I'll just quote two pretty good experts. One is Sun Tzu, who said, in order to cause the enemy to come of their own volition, extend some profits, in order to prevent the enemy from coming forth, show them the potential for harm. And the Roman general Vegetius also said, if you want peace, prepare for war. That is not, and I know I'm going to be accused of being a warmonger, but my only point is dialogue is good. It's great. I don't think anybody's against dialogue or negotiations. But as many other more experienced and wiser men have said, in diplomacy, in the absence of, or not backed by the possibility of force, I think is very, very empty and counterproductive.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Mark Dugge, German Radio. I have a question to Mr. Noland. I noticed that there's an increasing consensus in the U.S. that the engagement policy in South Korea towards North Korea, the Sunshine Policy, somewhat failed. Other experts say it couldn't succeed because it was jeopardized by the U.S. in the recent years. So there was not a really international backing for that. Would you agree with that?
I believe that the statement that the Sunshine Policy or the engagement policy had failed didn't come from the United States. It came from a presidential address the other night by President No. I think he's the one who said the policy had failed. What I would say is that my impression as an observer, and I want to make it quite clear, I support the notion of engagement with North Korea, especially from the standpoint of South Korea. I think engagement policy is fundamentally correct. But I think that when the engagement or Sunshine Policy was first introduced in 1998 by President Kim Dae-jung, it was explicitly designed to transform North Korea. Engagement was an instrument or a policy tool. Engagement was not a goal in and of itself. It was an attempt to transform North Korea into a more open society politically and economically, and thereby set the stage for eventual unification of the Korean Peninsula. What seems to have gotten lost in the intervening period is the notion that the goal of the policy was transformation. It seems that rather than being a tool or an instrument, in recent years, engagement has become a goal in and of itself. And as a consequence, it has embodied a lack of reciprocity or conditionality. And as a consequence, there's little to show for it. For that reason, the popularity of that policy and support for that policy in South Korea has been declining. And that's what really matters. It doesn't really matter what American observers believe. It matters what the South Korean public believes. And the South Korean public, I think, at this point is skeptical or increasingly skeptical about the policy. And that's why I think you got that presidential address the other night in which President No said that the policy had to be reconsidered, but without laying forth any groundwork or indicators of where the policy might go from here on out.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Sophomore at American University. My question is to Marcus Noland. Looking back, do you feel that the Bill Clinton's agreement with North Korea in 1994 was a complete failure? And if you think it's a failure, how do you think we should come about to prevent another deceptive diplomatic agreements?
If you talk to the people who negotiated the 1994 agreement on the American side, and if you talk to people who were serving in the South Korean government at that time, what you will find out is both the American negotiators and their South Korean counterparts did not believe that they would ever have to fully implement that agreement, because they believed that the North Korean regime would collapse. So essentially, what one of them told me was, we bought ourselves 10 years of time. And they thought that within that 10-year period, North Korea would collapse and the agreement would never have to be fully implemented. My supposition is that North Korea never intended to fully implement its obligations under the agreement either. And so you had a situation in which both governments entered into agreement that at some level both governments entered into the agreement with bad faith. What you can do now, I think, is future agreements have to be done in a multilateral way. I think the six-party talks process, which did not come out of the Bush administration, but rather came out of the experience of the American negotiators in 1994, is designed so that there is no daylight between the various parties, that everyone is signing on to the same agreement. You don't get the Monday morning quarterbacking like you did in 1994. So I think the basic idea of doing this in a multilateral forum is correct. The problem has obviously been in implementation.
I might make just one additional comment with respect to the agreed framework, which I was not involved in those negotiations. I would point out, though, that the agreed framework, as Marcus has noted, successfully shut down the plutonium program for close to a decade. Not only the Yongbyon reactor and the reprocessing, but it also terminated the construction on the two other reactors, the much larger reactors at Yongbyon and Taechon, that would have moved North Korea in a qualitatively different situation of being able to produce tens of warheads per year. So I think the standard shouldn't be an agreement versus a perfect agreement. The standard should be an agreement versus what the world is like in the absence of that agreement, factoring in opportunity costs. And in that sense, I believe that the agreed framework was a successful measure that admittedly failed in the end, primarily because of, for a whole host of reasons on both sides.
John Fox with Global Security Newswire. This question is for Dr. Chyba. Experts have said that there are quite a few challenges with attribution technology, and our capability might not be there right now. I'd like you to expand on your comments about the challenges to and status of nuclear forensics in the U.S.
Thank you. There's not a great deal in the open literature on that question. There's a recent piece in Arms Control Today. There's an article that the IEEE is or has just published by Michael May, former director of Lawrence Livermore, and two colleagues. The fundamental challenge is the absence of knowledge of the details of the plutonium and/or uranium produced in this whole set of programs around the world. There is information that can be gained from previous tests, so samples we acquired as a result of previous tests. There's information potentially to be gained from whatever sampling has taken place as a result of inspections that we might have access to. I cannot speak to whatever the kind of catalog might or might not be that the U.S. government, I simply don't know, that the U.S. government may have of these sort of samples that would help it with respect to attribution. I think the result of that is that in the absence of some, I don't want to use the word stockpile, some catalog of material where one could confidently ascribe an explosion to this or that particular stock in origin, and preferably even trace some of its root. I think there is liable to be an important credibility problem with respect to assigning any terrorist explosion to a particular perpetrator, absent other information. It's liable to be a very difficult problem, and that's an important problem that we need to work on rectifying.
Josh Kurtman with the Asahi Shimbun, and I think my question is addressed primarily to Mr. Kim. At the top level of society, how many individuals do we know of have leanings toward China in terms of policy? Because there's been a snub of China recently. Is that a uniform snub? And at a middle level, how many of the elites would have either professional or educational ties to China? And the thrust of my question is, in the event of regime collapse or change, how many friends would China have in North Korea?
Another good question.
How come I get asked all the easy ones? I have to be very frank with you. Your guess is as good as mine. I have absolutely no data. We have, in the open source, we have no indication of how many individuals among the top elites. And of course, as I try to point out, it depends on what you mean by elite. If I think you're insinuating that there might be pro-Chinese factions in the Kim Jong-il kitchen cabinet. If you look at the National Defense Commission, which Kim Jong-il heads up, there this is all, you can find it on the web. The average age of that committee is about 73 to 75. Most of them have forged their foreign policy experience during the Korean War, when China was an ally. Now, many of them are reaching 80, 85 years of age, and not many of them accompany Kim Jong-il to his on-spot guidance visits to military installations. I can't give you a number. I know I'm hemming and hawing, but so that I'll leave my answer limited to that. As for the middle class, again, I'm at a loss as to how to answer that question, because I know there's speculation. I mean, I know Robert Kaplan has written an article in Monthly and the Financial Times and the Frankfurter Allgemeine have all speculated that a military junta sympathetic to the PLA would emerge as victorious or emerge as the victor in any post-Kim Jong-il collapse or reunification scenarios. But I don't think they have much evidence to base that assertion. Not that doesn't mean that it's not true. It's just that I don't see that at all. I think that's old school way of thinking, that the PLA has contacts with the KPA, and that the old generation, Korean War generation, Chinese political leaders have influence with North Korean political leaders. But as you can tell, President Hu Jintao he's cleaning house, getting rid of the Shanghai faction of Jiang Zemin, and I think he wants to take China into a new direction. And I do not, this is speculation, I do not believe that Hu Jintao and his people have very, very close ties with Kim Jong-il and his people, as did Mao with Kim Il-sung. So,
thank you.
Sorry for that.
I'd like to ask, actually, Betsy, a follow-up question to that. Do we have any indication that the Chinese government is deliberately trying to increase flows of information into North Korea?
No, we don't have evidence. I mean, not that I know of. My impression is that they're more under the radar NGO missionary type efforts to increase flows of information. I don't know about any concerted Chinese effort.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Ed Kellum. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. My own experience has been largely in Eastern and Western Europe, but I've always heard that the question of face is very important, much more important in Asia than it is in the rest of the world. And of course, it's important also in the West, even in the United States. But I'd like to know the opinions on whether the question of losing face or gaining face is an important part of Korean policy at the moment. Thank you.
Anybody like to tackle that?
I think it depends on what kind of face you have. I don't want to be flip about it, but sure. I think the question of etiquette and what we call face is very important in Asian culture. However, I would caution people not to take that to its extremes. I mean, we in the West also have a certain level of etiquette and how to go about saving other people's face. And I can tell you that not all Asians are into saving face. I mean, they give as good as they get sometimes. They act just as quote-unquote Western as any Westerner can possibly act. So certainly there is that, but I don't think we should allow that cultural construct to limit us in how to think of constructive ways to either negotiate or confront the North Korean regime. That construct might be more applicable in how perhaps China, quote-unquote, manages or deals with North Korea more so than perhaps the United States or Japan, or I would even say South Korea. So,
thank you. We have about 3 minutes left.
Hi, I'm a member of the public. I have no media affiliations. I have two questions for Stephen Kim and one for Marcus Noland. My first question would be, would you characterize Kim Jong-il as sort of just trying, his purpose, I know you talked about motivations, as just trying to maintain the status quo and just kind of reactive, or is it in any way proactive, and does he really think he's going to, invade South Korea, all this kind of stuff? Second question, is there any, and somebody had mentioned that the purpose of one policy was to they thought the regime was only going to last 10 years. Is there any indication of anecdotal or otherwise defectors in the elite talking about the end of the regime, the possibility, and when? And my other question for Marcus Noland is, are there any economic indications of the longevity of the regime, like the sustainability of it, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start with Marcus and then Stephen.
The relationship between economic prosperity and regime durability there is some relationship, but it's a highly complex one. If you ask me about the collapse of North Korea, I would tell you that from an economic standpoint, it already collapsed, in the sense that given the expenditure preferences of the regime, it stopped producing enough output to support its population biologically sometime in the 1990s. Nevertheless, the political regime has carried on. I think that North Korea is extraordinary in that there are no other cases of regimes that have combined the degree of economic dysfunctionality that the North Koreans exhibit with this extraordinary political stability. So at some point, one would expect political change, and in fact it could come in a very abrupt way. But the fact of the matter is that the regime has a complete monopoly on social organization within North Korea. There are no institutions capable of channeling mass discontent into constructive political action. There's no Catholic Church as there was in Poland or in the Philippines. There's no Solidarity Trade Union. There's no civic forum. And externally, China and South Korea are not welcoming anti-Kim Jong-il political organizations. There's no headquarters of anti-Kim Jong-il activities in China like there were in the frontline states during the anti-apartheid era. And the South Koreans and Chinese are not giving haven to marauding anti-Kim Jong-il guerrilla armies like the Tunisians did in Algeria. So I think that it is difficult to predict that economic decline alone is going to lead to the imminent demise of this political regime.
Stephen, you have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. I think the motivation. The question was about motivation. I think they themselves have said, North Korean officials have recently, I think yesterday, have said it's about the money. And second is they felt they had no choice given the line drawn by President Bush and Christopher Hill. They said we will not tolerate a nuclear North Korea. In terms of whether the possibility exists of a Korean War, 1950, June 25th type of an invasion, I think most people would say that prospect is very low. I think President Clinton made it very, very clear when he made a speech at the DMZ. He said if they do that, it'll be the end of their country as they know it. So it's pretty clear that they, I think, know that. So if you're asking me will there be a repeat of 1950, no, I don't think so. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that they might try to extort money from South Korea. Precisely now, well, they're more strengthened now than ever before, since they do possess a non-conventional weapon.
Okay. One very short final question.
Bill Dorland, University of Maryland physics professor and Woodrow Wilson graduate. My question is, the panel has outlined a situation in which we have to make decisions really here in the U.S. from a great deal of uncertainty. And my question is, do the other parties in the six-party negotiations, other than North Korea, feel the same way, or do some of our other allies feel that they have more inside information? I don't know whether they do or not, but do they feel they have more information, or do they agree that you have to act and make decisions from a position of uncertainty?
It's a very good question. I think we will get some insight into it in our second panel. So rather than try to answer it, why don't we take a 5-minute break, 5 minutes only, and then reconvene here. Thank you very much.